Hello and welcome to video lecture number 102. Today we are talking about the end of the Cold War. Our subsections today are U.S.-Soviet relations in a new era, and finally a new political order at home and abroad. There's actually quite a bit to cover in today's video lecture, so we are going to just jump right in to the material with our examination of the subsections today. So again, we are talking about the end of the Cold War, starting with our first section, U.S.-Soviet relations in a new era. When Reagan assumed the presidency in 1981, he broke with his immediate predecessors in Cold War strategy. Nixon regarded himself as a realist in foreign affairs, which meant that advancing the national interest without regard to ideology was considered his best course of action. His policy of détente with the Soviet Union and China embodied his realist view. Carter endorsed détente and continued to push for relaxing Cold War tensions. This worked for a time, but the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan empowered hardliners in the U.S. Congress and forced Carter to take a tougher line, which he did with the Olympic boycott and grain embargo. Conservatives did not believe in détente. Neither did they believe in the containment policy that had guided U.S. Cold War strategy since 1947. Reagan and his advisors wanted to defeat the Soviet Union. His administration pursued a two-pronged strategy toward that end. First, it abandoned détente and set about rearming America. This buildup in American military strength, reasoned Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, would force the Soviets into an arms race that would strain their economy and cause domestic unrest. Second, the president supported CIA initiatives to roll back Soviet influence in the developing world by funding anti-communist movements in Angola, Mozambique, Afghanistan, and Central America. As a result, Reagan supported repressive right-wing regimes, particularly in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. In Guatemala, this approach produced a brutal military rule. Thousands of opponents of the government were executed or kidnapped. In Nicaragua, Reagan actively encouraged a coup against the left-wing Sandinista government, which had overthrown the U.S.-backed strongman Anastasio Somoza. And in El Salvador, the U.S.-backed government maintained secret death squads, which murdered members of the opposition. In each case, Reagan blocked Soviet influence. But the damage done to local communities and to the international reputation of the United States, as in Vietnam, was great. For years, Reagan had denounced Iran as an outlaw state and a supporter of terrorism. But in 1985, he wanted its help. To win Iran's assistance in freeing 24 American hostages, the administration sold arms to Iran without public or congressional knowledge. While this secret arms deal was diplomatically and politically controversial, the use of resulting profits in Nicaragua was explicitly illegal. To overthrow the democratically elected Sandinistas, which the president accused of threatening U.S. business interests, Reagan ordered the CIA to assist an armed opposition group called the Contras. Although Reagan praised the Contras as freedom fighters, Congress worried that the president and other executive branch agencies were assuming war-making powers that the Constitution reserved to the legislature. In 1984, Congress banned the CIA and any other government agency from providing any military support to the Contras. Oliver North, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps and an aide to the National Security Council, defied that ban. With the tacit or explicit consent of high-ranking administration officials, including the president, North used the profits from the Iranian arms deal to assist the Contras. Still swayed by Reagan's charm, the public accepted his convenient loss of memory. Nonetheless, the Iran-Contra affair resulted in the prosecution of Colonel North and several other officials and jeopardized the president's reputation. The Soviet system, then, of state socialism and central economic planning had transformed Russia from an agricultural to an industrial society between 1917 and the 1950s, but it had done so inefficiently. Most enterprises hoarded raw materials, employed too many workers, and did not develop new products. The Russian economy fell farther and farther behind those of capitalist societies, and most people in the Soviet bloc endured a low standard of living. Mikhail Gorbachev, a younger Russian leader, recognized the need for internal economic reform and an end to the war in Afghanistan. He introduced policies of glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, economic restructuring, which encouraged widespread criticism of the rigid institutions and authoritarian controls of the communist regime. To lessen tensions with the United States, Gorbachev met with Reagan, and by 1987, they had agreed to eliminate all intermediate-range nuclear missiles based in Europe. A year later, Gorbachev ordered Soviet troops out of Afghanistan, and Reagan replaced many of his hardline advisors with policymakers who favored a renewal of détente. As Gorbachev's efforts revealed the flaws of the Soviet system, the peoples of Eastern and Central Europe demanded the ouster of their communist governments. In Poland, the Roman Catholic Church and its Pope, Polish-born John Paul II, joined with Solidarity, the trade union movement, to overthrow the pro-Soviet regime. Soviet troops did not intervene, and a series of peaceful uprisings created a new political order throughout the region. The destruction of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the end of communist rule in Central Europe. Now, Soviet military leaders seized power in August of 1991 and arrested Mikhail Gorbachev. But widespread popular opposition led by Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, thwarted their efforts to oust Gorbachev from office. This failure broke the dominance of the Communist Party. On December 25, 1991, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics formally dissolved to make way for an 11-member Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS. The Russian Republic assumed leadership of the CIS, but the Soviet Union was no more. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the result of internal weaknesses of the communist economy. External pressure from the United States played an important, though secondary, role. All right, let's look at a new political order then in our next section, at home and abroad. Determined not to divide the country, Reagan did not actively push controversial policies espoused by the religious right. While Reagan failed to roll back the social welfare and regulatory state of the New Deal, Great Society era, he changed the dynamic of American politics. His anti-government rhetoric won many adherents, as did his bold and fiscally dangerous tax cuts. George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president and successor, was not beloved by conservatives, but he possessed an insider's familiarity with government and a long list of powerful allies, accumulated over 3 decades of public service. Bush's route to the White House reflected the post-Reagan alignments in American politics. In the primaries, he faced a spirited challenge from Pat Robertson, the arch-conservative televangelist. On the Democratic side, Jesse Jackson became the first African-American to challenge for a major party nomination, winning 11 states in primary and caucus voting. However, the much less charismatic Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis emerged as the Democratic nominee. George Bush won with 53% of the vote, a larger margin of victory than Reagan's in 1980. The end of the Cold War left the United States as the only military superpower and raised the prospect of a new world order, dominated by the United States and its European and Asian allies. But American officials and diplomats now confronted an array of regional, religious, and ethnic conflicts that defied easy solutions. None were more pressing or more complex than those in the Middle East. Middle Eastern conflicts would dominate the foreign policy of the United States for the next 2 decades, replacing the Cold War at the center of American geopolitics. After Carter's 1979 Egypt-Israel Treaty at Camp David, there were few bright spots in U.S. Middle Eastern diplomacy. In 1982, the Reagan administration supported Israel's invasion of Lebanon, a military operation intended to destroy the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. When Lebanese militants, angered at U.S. intervention on behalf of Israel, killed 24 United States Marines in their barracks, Reagan abruptly withdrew the forces. 3 years later, Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip and along the west bank of the Jordan River, territories occupied by Israel since 1967, mounted an intifada, which is a civilian uprising against Israeli authority. In response, American diplomats stepped up their efforts to persuade the PLO and Arab nations to accept the legitimacy of Israel and to convince the Israelis to allow the creation of a Palestinian state. Neither initiative met with much success. American interest in a reliable supply of oil from the region led the United States into a short but consequential war in the Persian Gulf in the 1990s. In August 1990, Iraq went to war to expand its boundaries and oil supply. Iraqi troops quickly conquered the small, oil-rich neighbor of Kuwait and threatened Saudi Arabia, the site of 1/5 of the world's known oil reserves and an informal ally of the United States. To preserve Western access to oil, President Bush sponsored a series of resolutions in the United Nations Security Council calling for Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait. Bush then successfully prodded the UN to authorize the use of force. And the president organized a military coalition of 34 different nations. Dividing mostly along party lines, the Republican-led House of Representatives authorized American participation by a vote of 252 to 182. And the Democratic-led Senate agreed by the close margin of 52 to 47. The coalition forces, led by the United States, quickly won the war for the liberation of Kuwait. Bush decided against occupying Iraq and removing Saddam Hussein from power. And instead, he won passage of UN Resolution 687, which imposed economic sanctions against Iraq. The military victory, low incidence of American casualties, and quick withdrawal produced a euphoric reaction at home. But Saddam Hussein remained a formidable power in the region. His alleged ambitions were one factor that, in March 2003, would cause Bush's son, President George W. Bush, to initiate another war in Iraq, one that would be much more protracted, expensive, and bloody for Americans and Iraqis alike. The post-Cold War world promised to be a multipolar one, with great centers of power in Europe, the United States, and East Asia, and seemingly intractable conflict in the Middle East. All right, so that does conclude our video lecture for today. At this time, go ahead and answer those review questions at the bottom of your screen and continue on with your work.